Steam Deck killer, Switch slayer, overpriced paperweight, the ROG Ally has been dubbed a lot of things. And now that we're almost 2 months post worldwide release, and by worldwide I mean USA, Canada, and those two guys in Europe and Asia, I figured it was time to finally review this thing. And if you were looking for an unsponsored, unbiased, and unfiltered review, you found one. Because this was paid for using my own money, much like basically everything on this channel. So if you're into independent reviews, here it is. In typical fashion for this channel, I'll also go over things like pros, cons, show off some benchmarks, and then give you my final verdict. So check out the timestamps if you're in the click happy crowd. Just to get started, here's a quick rundown of some of the specs and how they stack up against the heavyweight champ, the Steam Deck, as well as a popular contender, the Neo 2S. Keep in mind, there are several other challengers in this space, like the One X Fly and GPD Win 4, with pretty similar specs. Opening the box and starting up the ROG Boy was pretty straightforward, and while many reviewers have complained about the nuisances of updating drivers and typical Windows shenanigans, I would say that the Ally setup experience was slightly better than what I had experienced with other Windows handhelds like the AOK Zoe A1. No, it is by no means as simple as starting up your Steam Deck and inputting your credentials, but I do think ASUS has done an adequate job at streamlining Windows here for the handheld format. There are still plenty of kinks that need to be fixed, like the on-screen keyboard Windows ships with, which is garbage, to put it nicely. But in terms of ASUS's implementation of their new Armoury Crate app, it's worked fairly well, prompting me to update, not getting stuck between game and overlay, usually, and well, generally not crashing every 2 minutes. They've clearly taken cues from iNeo's iSpace and even One Netbook and AOK Zoe's player consoles, but it absolutely needs work, and I'll speak on that more later. Now, the weight and size of the device was a definite welcome after using the heavier brethren like the One X Player 2 and even the Steam Deck. I won't go so far as to say it feels like a toy, but the weight difference is indisputable. And here's a side-by-side comparison of some of the footprints. Sorry, I no longer have some of the devices, so the size comparison is limited. An obvious trade-off with the lighter device, of course, is that it typically translates to a smaller battery and reduced battery life, and that's no exception here. For the display, coming from the One X Player 2, there was undoubtedly a huge difference in visuals, as that has an 8.4-inch display, whereas the Ally has a 7-inch display, and that's not even mentioning the resolutions. But while I'm a self-proclaimed hater of bezels, and I don't like this one, the high refresh rate, FreeSync, and ability to switch color profiles made up for the smaller screen at least a little bit, in my opinion. Once again, you do lose out on battery life as well as screen real estate when coming from those larger devices. Moving over to the controls and other features, the larger thumbsticks and buttons feel more akin to the Steam Deck, and that's a definite plus. The baby sticks and buttons on the One X Player 2 are... you'll have to find out in my One X Player 2 review. The buttons feel responsive enough, and Armoury Crate does have dead zone settings for the sticks and triggers. The buttons on the back are nice and clicky, though I could see someone complaining about their placement as they protrude out from the device and feel a bit unnatural, whereas for the Steam Deck's buttons, they feel a bit more in line with the design language, plus there are 4 buttons there instead of 2. But I do like the controls overall, and the RGB lighting around the sticks are a nice plus for some added FPS, of course. In terms of comfort, I think Russ from Retro Gamecore gave a really good tip when he suggested you arch your palms inward, and that definitely feels more comfortable, as the edges aren't digging into your hands. Of course, a sleeve will probably help with that though, if you can't be bothered to change your grip style. So if I want to nitpick about the overall design, I'll say that one USB-C port is a bit annoying, but the Steam Deck also has the same limitation. So as long as you have an adapter or a hub like this Red Magic one that I reviewed previously, it shouldn't be that big of a deal. As for other ports like the microSD slot, I'll get to that later in the video. The XG Mobile port I didn't get to test as I don't have an XG Mobile eGPU, but from what I've looked up, they work sort of as expected, improving performance of the Ally when plugged in, preferably to an external display. When it comes to eGPUs though, those things are never straightforward with Windows. Now, for the fingerprint sensor on the Ally, it's a nice to have, though from my experience, I found it worked less often than the one that the Neo 2 shipped with. The face buttons call up Armoury Crate, or Armoury Crate Command Center, and both work well and are a nice use of the layout on the device. Now, I don't normally talk about speakers in my reviews, but these are pretty good sounding. Front-facing speakers like the ones on the Ally and the Deck are definitely my preference for handhelds. Moving over to performance, for specific benchmarks, I'll show them in the charts, but basically, I was pleasantly surprised by its capability. Now, BIOS drama notwithstanding, I did have to redo the benchmarks a few times due to the updates. This isn't a complaint about ASUS in that regard though, as they should be addressing issues that come up. So when I was playing some premier titles like Diablo 4, Hogwarts Legacy, and Division 2, I did feel a difference coming from the 6800U chips, not having to push the wattage higher than the typical 15 watts to get what I felt like was reasonable frame rates, but you'll see those in the charts. The typical suite I had established before went completely out the window for this review, as one of the titles, the Division 2, didn't run at all in benchmarking mode. Thanks, Ubisoft. And as I said earlier, I had to redo the test multiple times due to BIOS updates over the course of filming, so instead of just throwing those results out, I included some of them in the charts you can see next. And they're listed as 319 referring to BIOS 319 and 322 referring to BIOS 322. Each game was tested 3 times at each setting for each game, using the in-game benchmark to get as close to a reproducible result as possible. Each game was also run at 720p, despite the Deck having a native 800p to match resolutions. FSR balance was also used when possible, as well as using the Ally's default RAM setting. I also tested each title at 1080p though, just to get an idea of performance for the Ally. Looking first at Cyberpunk 2077. You can see that, just as we expected, the Steam Deck face rolls the Ally at 10 watts, and you'll see this trend continue throughout the benchmark. Interestingly for Cyberpunk, which I had tested for both BIOS 319 and 322, there isn't a clear advantage for BIOS 322 at 720p. Something else you'll see as a common theme throughout the benchmarks is that the Ally pulls away at 15 watts generally. And now here's the chart for Cyberpunk at 1080p. In this case, BIOS 322 appeared to be a bit more consistent in terms of better frame rates. Moving over to Shadow of the Tomb Raider, we again see similar results at 10 and 15 watts. This game seems to be pretty darn optimized for the Deck though, as we'd expect more than the tiny advantage the Ally has at 15 watt low settings. Interestingly, as you move up through to the high settings, the Ally has a much larger lead at more than 20% and nearly double the minimum frame rate. Then, as we look at the 25 watt numbers, at the low settings, we see frame rates exceed 60, meaning we could actually make use of that higher refresh rate display in the Ally for this specific case. For 1080p, once again, we see unplayable frame rates at 10 watts. Now for GTA 5, I found some just strange results. For the Deck's results, they were basically the same at both 10 and 15 watts. I'm not sure exactly what happened, but I ran each test an additional 2 times to ensure that it wasn't a mistake, and this is what I got. Either way, we see again at 10 watts, the Ally underperforms the Steam Deck, but at 15 and 25 watts, we would actually be really able to take advantage of that higher refresh rate. For 1080p, we're still able to make use of the higher than 60 FPS at 15 watts. This is an older title for sure, but it still looks pretty decent for today's age, and especially with mods, I'm sure it looks quite good. Finally, we have Horizon Zero Dawn. For this title, we can see the Steam Deck at 720p low or performance setting hitting the 60 FPS cap. So if you're playing this on Deck, you might as well bump up the quality. Again though, the Ally at 10 watts is just begging for mercy, and it isn't until we go above 15 watts, in this case at 25, where we see the Ally begin to stretch its legs. Then at 1080p, we see very playable frame rates at 15 watts and above. Normally at this point, I'd also include dollars per frame rate metric, but that was ruined by the Division 2, so I'll just say from observation, you'd be a fool to assume that the Ally wins straight out in terms of value. However, just like with my previous reviews, the Ally has a performance tier that the Deck simply cannot reach. Something to note here also is that I used as close to out-of-the-box settings as I could for both the Deck and Ally for these benchmarks, meaning you could likely still eke out some performance from both platforms using cryo utilities on Steam Deck or various performance tweaks on the Ally. Anyway, now that performance is out of the way, let me tell you more specifically what I don't like about the device. First, the battery life isn't great. I think most users would have preferred the equivalent weight of a Steam Deck with an increased battery size to say 44 or 48 watt hours, because when you have a device that pushes 28 to 30 watts, every watt hour counts. And being a Windows-based device obviously leaves much to be desired in terms of user experience experience for a handheld. ASUS hasn't helped that much in that regard, because really, ASUS, you couldn't find a way to get rid of Office or OneDrive? Surely you have enough control over what ships with your devices to exclude those. And as for other bloatware, why is it that you need both Armoury Crate and MyASUS to handle updates? Take a cue from Corsair's iQOO, dad pun intended, and use Armoury Crate as your all-in-one solution. Have Armoury Crate as your front-end launcher, just as you already have it, then also add in some overclocking features like what you have in GPU Tweak. Or better yet, just retire GPU Tweak and fold it into Armoury Crate. Another thing I don't like about the device is the ALP sticks. While they seem to be pretty accurate, we're treading on premium priced devices above $500. So why not just have Hall sensors? It's one of those design choices that doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, kinda like not having a kickstand, using proprietary eGPU port, or placing a microSD card right next to the exhaust ports. And on that topic, you may have heard now of the microSD card issue plaguing these devices, and during this review, my Ally also fell victim. Since ASUS has now acknowledged the issue on their forums and outlined a path to repair or replacement, I can't help but wonder why there hasn't been a statement on their official landing page or anything communicated through Best Buy. That's one of the biggest advantages ASUS has over these Chinese companies with their supply chain access, so why not use it and show your customers that ROG reach? At the time of filming, there isn't a clear indication of how to remedy this issue short of a hardware revision, and because of that, I and surely many others are reluctant to send in their devices, get it repaired, and then have the same thing happen again a week later. And that brings me to my verdict. Should you buy an ROG Ally? I really do like the Ally. There are a lot of good things going for it, like the display, the weight, the performance, and of course, the pricing. But if you let me soapbox again for a moment, the microSD card situation I just spoke about is no minor issue to anyone intending to use it, and it needs to be addressed with clear communication. ASUS, if you want to be the company we have faith in and rely on as your quote, Republic of Gamers, you need to give us reason to feel that way. Otherwise, little would separate you from those Chinese handheld companies. Surely, someone smarter than me can communicate to your customers what your plan is, whether that's flat out replacements, returns through Best Buy, or whatever. Your customers are more understanding than you might think, but only if we have faith in the brand and the product. Okay, rant over. So let's get to the real final thought. If you're not scared off by the microSD card issue, maybe you don't need to wait. But essentially, waiting is what I'd recommend right now. Waiting for what exactly? This sponsored message, of course, from me, because as promised, this video is not sponsored by anyone, so help a guy out and click the buttons, would you? Thanks. Really, waiting is what I suggest because there are so many other good options out there in the handheld space. None are as easy to pick up from the store, like an Ally, but then there's the elephant or the king in the room, the Steam Deck. Blame it on Windows or say that SteamOS is a better system for games. The bottom line is that the Ally is a flawed device with a ton of potential. So if you're looking for the easiest way to get into PC games and want that console-like experience, the deck is still really hard to beat. But if you know you're okay with dealing with Windows jank and want the potential for more performance, no, don't go and buy an Ally now. I said wait, were you not listening? Wait just a little longer for ASUS to iron out some of these issues, and by then, maybe the device will be great. And if not, there are a ton of other Windows handhelds that'll either be discounted or newly released. So what do you think? Do you agree? Am I being too aggressive? Or would you rather check out one of these handhelds instead?
GG.